Samuel Hamilton stepped onto the plane with the calm, resolute demeanor of a man who had weathered storms in boardrooms and in life. As the flight attendant greeted his family, her practiced smile masked a prejudice that was as subtle as it was cruel. "Excuse me, but I believe you may be in the wrong section," she said in a tone that made no secret of her disbelief that a well-dressed African-American family could be traveling first class. Her words hung in the pressurized air of the cabin, sparking curious glances and hushed whispers among other passengers settled into plush leather seats. Samuel, with his tall, athletic 6'2" stature and salt and pepper hair trimmed neatly, calmly explained that they were indeed in their proper seats. Holding 4 boarding passes, one for himself, one for his elegant wife Denise, and one each for their teenagers Zoe and Marcus, he delivered his reply in a measured tone that masked the sting of indignation. Deep within him, he knew that every patronizing remark reinforced an old wound, a reminder of how far society still had to go. Yet he always carried himself with dignity even when the subtle racism reared its head. Unbeknownst to the flight attendant, however, staring quietly over her shoulder from behind a copy of the Wall Street Journal was Richard Covington, the cold and calculating CEO of Transcontinental Airlines. Covington's presence was a silent threat, for his interests were now tightly interwoven with every nuance of Samuel's life and investments. Just hours before, Samuel Hamilton and his family had maneuvered through the controlled chaos of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport with the practiced grace of seasoned travelers. But the journey was about to take on a darker, more consequential tone. As the family moved toward security and then to the first-class lounge, the air vibrated with a mix of residual tension and the unspoken promise of retribution. Samuel's heart, though steady and composed in public, burned with the need to eventually respond, not with a quiet resignation, but with a thunderous stand against the systemic injustices he'd long endured. Inside the first-class lounge, amid muted earth tones and the quiet murmur of luxury and exclusivity, Samuel's mind was already racing ahead to more pressing matters. He reviewed messages on his phone with a clinical eye, noting an email from his analytics team that confirmed a troubling trend. While overall passenger satisfaction ratings for Transcontinental Airlines remained above industry average, there was a stark, statistically significant discrepancy between the experiences of white travelers and those of passengers of color. It was a confirmation of a pattern no one else dared articulate so bluntly. For decades, Samuel had battled against the everyday microaggressions that chipped away at his dignity, growing increasingly aware that these small indignities were part of a vast network of prejudice designed to keep him and those like him in a lower echelon of respect. In a private, hushed conversation that would soon spiral into an epic conflict, Richard Covington had sent an email earlier that day hinting at a game-changing board meeting and personal discussion aboard the flight to New York. Covington's words dripped with a condescension that made it clear he regarded Samuel not as a partner in progress but as an inconvenience, an obstacle to the status quo he had meticulously cultivated. The email was laced with an arrogance that combined business acumen with personal malice, and as Samuel read the message, a cold fury began to simmer. This was not just about a seating mix-up at check-in. This was a personal affront, a challenge set by a man who had made it his mission to keep people like Samuel in their place. The tension between the two men, already implicit in their roles as investor and airline magnate, had slowly been escalating over months of subtle yet cutting power plays. Covington had repeatedly underestimated Samuel, his dismissive tone in emails and secretive side conversations, a constant reminder of the deep-rooted racism that still permeated the upper echelons of the corporate world. And so, as the first-class lounge buzzed with the quiet intensity of high-profile business travelers, Samuel silently planned his retaliation. Not in a moment of reckless anger, but in a calculated, determined way that was as inevitable as it was explosive. Every step that Samuel took through the airport corridors was laden with memories of past indignities, 1,000 small microaggressions that, when combined, could no longer be ignored. His family's expressions, a blend of quiet understanding and underlying worry, mirrored the inner conflict that plagued him, the constant heavy burden of protecting his children while also nurturing the relentless desire to reclaim his dignity. Denise, stylish and composed in her comfortable yet classy travel attire, walked beside him with the poise of a woman who had borne witness to too many injustices in her 25 years by his side. She too longed for a day when the scales of power might finally tip in favor of decency over cruelty. Over the years, Samuel had built his fortune from humble beginnings. A scholarship to Morehouse College, long nights spent perfecting his craft, and the establishment of JMV Capital Partners, which now managed billions in assets. This was not mere luck, but the result of relentless perseverance in the face of systemic barriers. As a father, he had always emphasized to Zoe and Marcus the dual responsibility of enjoying success and using it as a lever to make societal changes. Yet, none of his long-winded lectures could fully prepare his children for the raw, unpleasant truth that the world, even in 2023, was still marred by prejudice and discrimination. That awareness had been painfully highlighted by the day's unfolding events. During the check-in process, a subtle yet chilling micro-expression from a biased attendant had confirmed what Samuel had long suspected. His identity alone was enough to unsettle the carefully constructed expectations of those around him. He recalled vivid memories of his early career when such surprises were more overt. Public insults, confused stares, and even outright verbal dismissals. Now, the hostility was subtler yet more insidious, demanding a response that would shake the complacency of a society blinded by tradition. It was in that lounge, surrounded by the polished veneer of luxury and exclusivity, that Samuel began to envision the monumental retaliation that would not only shatter the delicate balance of power, but also signal a turning point for all who had suffered at the hands of discrimination. His mind whirled with images of boardrooms where the status quo was questioned with unwavering resolve, and of board meetings that would soon become battlegrounds for justice. The idea of exposing the hypocrisy within transcontinental airlines, of forcing Richard Covington into a corner where his arrogance would be met with overwhelming retribution, filled him with a determined fire that could not be quenched. As he continued scrolling through emails and customer satisfaction reports, Samuel's thoughts grew darker and more focused. He saw numbers and charts that spoke not just of minor inconveniences, but of an institutional disregard for equality, a gap wide enough to be exploited for change. With every statistic, his resolve solidified. This was no longer a fight for comfortable seating or polite repartee. It was a war against a system that had demeaned him and his community for far too long. His plan, though still in its embryonic stages, promised to deliver a response so grand that even those who had quietly reveled in their discrimination would be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. In the midst of this internal storm of calculated vengeance and righteous indignation, Samuel's family noticed the change in his demeanor. Zoe, always perceptive beyond her years, quietly remarked during a lull in their conversation, "Dad, it feels like you're planning something big." Samuel managed a small smile in response, but did not let on the full extent of his brewing storm. He understood the nuances of his responsibility, not just to himself, but to every person who had ever been diminished by a single biased remark. Denise's eyes, soft yet resolute, mirrored the silent solidarity of a woman who had seen similar injustices over her lifetime. Together they carried the heavy weight of expectation and hope. While Samuel's plan was destined to culminate in an explosive showdown that would turn heads and force society to reconsider its prejudiced norms, he was acutely aware that the cost might be high. The coming days promised a clash of wills and moral certainties, a showdown where Richard Covington's meticulously crafted image of corporate invincibility would be put to the test. As the family settled into the luxurious confines of the first-class lounge, the stark contrast between the refined elegance around them and the simmering turmoil within Samuel was palpable. The cool, calculated corporate world and the raw, personal battle for dignity were about to collide. This was not merely an incident of mistaken seating, it was the spark that would ignite a revolution of retribution. And as Samuel Hamilton prepared to board the flight to New York, he carried not just his boarding passes and emails, but a burning desire to dismantle the oppressive systems that had for so long dictated the terms of his existence. In that moment, every subtle glance, every hushed remark, and every biased assumption coalesced into a promise that his eventual showdown would be nothing short of spectacular, that his meticulously orchestrated response would leave the world momentarily stunned and, dare we say, impressed by the power of righteous retribution. Samuel Hamilton felt a surge of satisfaction as he sensed his meticulously planned strategy was unfolding even faster than he had anticipated. After 18 long months of steadily increasing the position of JMV Capital Partners in Transcontinental Airlines, an airline with solid fundamentals yet marred by outdated customer service practices and a long trail of discrimination complaints, Samuel was on the verge of gaining the influence he needed to force real, dramatic change. His personal experiences as a black executive enduring endless indignities while traveling had shaped his investment philosophy. He truly believed that an airline that prioritized dignity, respect, and outstanding service for all its passengers could become not only more just, but ultimately more profitable. The data did not lie, but the current board was stubbornly resistant to the sweeping cultural transformation Samuel felt was so desperately needed. Richard Covington, the cold and calculating CEO, had hinted at a possible board position during a brief exchange earlier. That seemingly innocuous comment was now a signal that the resistance might be finally weakening. Samuel pocketed his phone with quiet confidence and joined his family at the buffet in the first-class cabin of Flight 1382. The cabin was designed to cocoon its occupants in luxury, with wide seats that transformed into fully flat beds, privacy partitions, and premium noise-canceling headphones. Yet, behind this elegant facade lay a storm that was about to break. Seated in the cabin with his family, Samuel noticed Richard Covington already calmly sitting one row behind them. Covington gave him a subtle nod of recognition but made no move to approach, clearly preferring to keep their connection discreet for the moment. Samuel returned the nod with a slight inclination of his head and turned his attention to settling his 12-year-old son Marcus into his seat, carefully showing him how to adjust the seat controls and where to store his backpack for easy access. Marcus remarked with innocent amazement that this was so much nicer than the flight they had taken to visit his grandmother last year. Samuel explained that it was a different airline and that Transcontinental Airlines had truly outdone itself with their premium service. Yet, as he spoke, his tone was layered with the subtle frustration of having to defend his family's rightful place in first class. Their careful conversation was a reflection not only of a father teaching his son about the basics of travel, but also of the deeper implications of being forced to justify their presence in a space where many still secretly questioned whether they belonged. As the family continued through the cabin, Patricia Hewson, the flight attendant whose earlier patronizing remarks still stung, approached once more with their boarding passes. Samuel felt the tension in the air intensify as onlookers watched the interaction with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. In that moment, every action, every slight, and every word was amplified. Samuel handed over the boarding passes and watched as Patricia examined them with exaggerated thoroughness. "Everything seems to be in order," she finally admitted, though there was an unmistakable note of reluctance in her voice. She added that first class had certain expectations regarding attire and decorum, without explicitly stating that they expected passengers to look like they belonged in that realm. Samuel's voice, calm yet tinged with a controlled firmness, responded that he was fully aware of what was required and that none of those expectations involved assumptions about race or appearance. His words cut through the tense silence of the cabin, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Behind him, Richard Covington lowered his copy of the Wall Street Journal slightly, now paying full attention to the unfolding drama. Patricia's face flushed slightly as she maintained her professional composure, insisting that she was simply doing her job. But her behavior clearly revealed discomfort with the confrontation. Before Patricia could further engage the situation, a younger flight attendant named James Chin stepped in with a warm smile, asking if they needed any pre-departure beverages. His intervention, while professional and courteous, did little to erase the palpable tension that had filled the air moments earlier. Vanessa, Samuel's graceful and elegant wife, warmly requested sparkling water for herself and for Zoe, while Samuel quickly confirmed similar orders for himself and Marcus. As James retreated to prepare the drinks, Patricia lingered uncertainly, as if trying to find an exit from the predicament she had inadvertently created. After a few moments, she offered a tight, forced smile and wished them an enjoyable flight before moving on to attend to other passengers. Samuel settled into his seat with an acute awareness that Richard Covington was now openly watching him. Their history was not new. They had met several times over the past year at various industry events and behind closed doors, as Samuel's stake in the airline grew ever larger. Covington, a man who had once dismissed the notion of diversity as a mere checkbox in a company brochure, had slowly come to see Samuel's vision for transforming the culture and service model of transcontinental airlines. Their most recent encounter had been especially revealing when Samuel had presented his comprehensive data showing that tackling discrimination head-on could boost the airline's market share among premium passengers. It was a passionate presentation that had left even the seasoned CEO with no choice but to listen, though his cool exterior barely concealed a growing inner turmoil. Now, as Samuel observed the interactions unfolding in the first-class cabin, every polite gesture seemed layered with deeper implications. He glanced at his phone as it vibrated with a text message from Richard Covington. The message read in a tone that was cryptic and almost challenging. "Interesting start to our flight. Perhaps our conversation is even more timely than I realized." Samuel smiled slightly and tucked his phone away, his mind already racing with possibilities. He knew that the universe had just provided a real-world example of the injustices he had been fighting against, a microcosm of the persistent bias that his personal and professional battles had always highlighted. He listened as James Chen returned with their drinks, his service attentive yet devoid of the warmth they had come to expect from courteous hospitality. The announcement that the plane would be taking off soon prompted a renewed sense of urgency in Samuel. He looked toward Marcus, who was still troubled by the earlier interaction with Patricia Hewson. Gently, Samuel reassured his son that the incident spoke more about the limited thinking of those people than about the worth of his family. It was crucial, Samuel explained, to challenge those assumptions, respectfully but firmly. Across the aisle, Zoe's eyes narrowed as she absorbed every word of the conversation that echoed the deeper struggles of race and dignity in a society still steeped in prejudice. Vanessa, whose background as a professor of sociology specializing in racial equity lent a scholarly air to her gentle but forceful questions, added that respect was not something to be granted by others, it was something to be maintained by holding on to one's own dignity. Her words resonated with everyone in the family and with every person who had ever felt diminished by subtle racism. Samuel's heart swelled with equal parts pride and sorrow. He knew that their battle was not just about securing better services on a flight. It was about forcing a powerful institution to reckon with its discriminatory practices. As the remaining passengers boarded and the doors closed for departure, Patricia Hewson made her way back through the cabin to complete her safety checks. Her demeanor remained cool and professional, but her eyes notably avoided Samuel's. The tension that had been simmering throughout the check-in process had now evolved into a more complex dance of power and defiance. The plane pushed back from the gate, and as it taxied toward the runway, Samuel felt both the weight of history and the promise of a dramatic, long overdue reckoning. Samuel gazed out the window as the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, ascending to a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. He marveled at the patchwork landscape below, where the borders and divisions of humankind seemed insignificant compared to the vast, unifying perspective of the earth from above. In that moment, Samuel's thoughts drifted back to the legacy of his father, Jerome Hamilton, who had devoted 42 years of his life to the Postal Service and marched with Dr. King in the turbulent yet hopeful days of the 1960s. His father's words echoed in his memory, "It is not enough to get yourself through the door. Once you are in the room, you must make it better for those coming after you." This ethos had guided Samuel from his days as one of the few black students at Harvard Business School to his early years at Morgan Stanley, and finally to founding his own investment firm. Success, Samuel had learned early on, was not solely measured by personal achievement, but by the ability to create pathways for others. Just as he was lost in these thoughts, Marcus excitedly pointed to the screen embedded in the seat back in front of them, remarking that they had the movie they had wanted to see. Samuel smiled warmly, the moment providing a brief respite from the tension swirling in the cabin. They gathered as a family to watch the movie, their shared experience offering comfort and a temporary escape from the weight of their daily battles. Yet even as the family settled into the embrace of a familiar film, Samuel remained keenly aware of the dynamics playing out around him. Patricia Hewson continued her work among the other first-class passengers, her service efficient and polite. The contrast between her treatment of other passengers and the subtle, almost imperceptible bias she exhibited towards Samuel's family remained a bittersweet reminder of the systemic challenges they faced. Samuel's mind churned with determination. Every slight, every biased glance, and every dismissive comment had accumulated into an unyielding desire for retribution that promised to shake the very foundations of a system long skewed by discrimination. In that fateful moment high above the earth, Samuel Hamilton resolved that this flight would not simply be another journey marked by silent suffering. Instead, it would serve as a catalyst for a confrontation so powerful that even Richard Covington would be forced to reckon with the consequences of his cruelty. Samuel knew that his carefully orchestrated response was imminent, a response that would not only expose the hypocrisy within transcontinental airlines, but also deliver a shock so profound that it would leave onlookers in awe. There was an unmistakable certainty in his heart that the time for quiet endurance had ended. It was time for a dramatic, far-reaching statement that would not only restore his dignity, but also illuminate the path toward true equality for all who had suffered in silence. Samuel Hamilton could feel the difference between service that was merely adequate and service that made passengers feel genuinely welcomed and valued. And across the aisle, he saw Vanessa quietly cataloging the micro-behaviors in her sociologist's mind, noting every subtle slight that created disparate experiences. Zoe, with her headphones on but eyes alert and narrowing at each perceived injustice, watched intently as an hour into the flight, the lunch service began. Patricia, the flight attendant whose earlier actions had already stoked a fire of indignation within Samuel, moved through the cabin, taking orders with a demeanor that shifted ever so slightly as she approached Samuel's family. "We have filet mignon or seared salmon today," she announced in a tone that was professional yet devoid of the warmth she lavished upon other passengers. Samuel responded evenly, "I'll try the salmon," while Vanessa, sitting across the aisle, replied with a steady tone, "Filet mignon for me." Zoe, not lifting her eyes from her book, added, "Same for me," and Marcus, ever polite despite the earlier tension, softly said, "I'd like the steak too, please." Patricia nodded and moved on without engaging in the small talk that had once made service feel personalized, leaving the Johnson family, whom Samuel now represented, with a pride tempered by hard-won experience, in a space that stung with unequal treatment. James Chen, another attendant who exuded genuine warmth and attentive care, saw the disparity immediately. He presented a small plate of artisanal cheeses and cured meats as an appetizer, engaging with the family by asking Marcus about the movie he was watching, and complimenting Zoe on her choice of literature. When Zoe mentioned that she had just finished Toni Morrison's Beloved, a book that had transformed her understanding of history, James replied with a knowing smile and a gentle caution not to spoil the surprise of the narrative's innovative twist. This natural human interaction, a connection that elevated travel beyond mere transportation, only highlighted what had been missing in Patricia's treatment of the family. It wasn't about the extra amenities. It was about feeling seen as individuals worthy of genuine engagement rather than merely as passengers processed through a system steeped in routine. Samuel noticed Richard Covington watching this exchange with an expression that betrayed a mixture of thoughtfulness and unease. For Covington, who had spent years on the corporate ladder insisting on an image of polished perfection, this real-time demonstration of service disparities, the subtle yet unmistakable preferential treatment shown to white passengers, was a live case study in the very issues Samuel had been meticulously documenting for his board meetings. As the main courses were served, a delicate display of culinary art featuring seared salmon and perfectly cooked filet mignon on fine bone china with real silverware. An elderly white gentleman seated near Covington, identified by Samuel as Walter Bradshaw, struck up a warm conversation with Patricia. "Patricia, you have been taking care of me on this route for what, 10 years now?" Bradshaw inquired in a tone that mixed familiarity with genuine appreciation. Patricia replied evenly, "Almost 11 years now, Mr. Bradshaw, since you started making your monthly trips to check on your East Coast investments." Bradshaw recalled fondly the days when Transcontinental still operated older planes with less comfortable seats, and Patricia's service had been a saving grace in an era of outdated aircraft. Their banter about the now modern fleet and the consistent comfort it provided was a reminder to Samuel of what exemplary service should be. Yet even as these interactions played out, Samuel's trained eyes observed how Patricia's attentive and warm service was noticeably absent when she passed by his family's seats, leaving them on the edge of dismissive neglect. James soon appeared to offer drink refills and clear away the appetizer plates for Samuel's family, his demeanor an earnest apology almost on cue as he asked, "How is everything so far?" Samuel replied that while the food was excellent, the service was inconsistent, a comment delivered not in anger but in measured disappointment. A disappointment born not solely out of culinary preference, but out of a deeper systemic inequity. James's expression flickered with a mix of understanding and remorse as he promised to return shortly with the main courses. Across the aisle, Vanessa leaned toward Samuel and whispered, "It's textbook, isn't it?" Her voice carried a quiet determination as she remarked that the disparate treatment was subtle enough to be brushed off as mere perception. But it was exactly this lack of clear metrics and accountability that allowed such biases to persist indefinitely. Samuel nodded and confirmed that it was one of the many issues he planned to address once he secured a stronger foothold on the board, a move he believed could revolutionize Transcontinental's approach to service equity. As the meal service continued, Samuel's eyes darted over the cabin and observed Richard Covington's occasional glances in his direction, the CEO's gaze heavy with a mix of calculated assessment and emerging discomfort. While the luxurious flight provided the setting for an elaborate affair of premium dining at 30,000 feet, every gesture, from Patricia's professional yet impersonal service to James's more genuine interactions, spoke volumes about the underlying racial dynamic. Vanessa's eyes shone with a blend of pride and sorrow as she remembered her late father, Jerome, and the lessons he had instilled in her about dignity, perseverance, and the necessity of challenging prejudice even in the smallest moments. Samuel felt a tightening in his chest with every reminder of his father's passing 3 years ago, knowing that his own journey from humble beginnings to becoming one of Transcontinental's largest individual investors was a tribute to those sacrifices and to the relentless pursuit of fairness. After the meal trays were cleared, Samuel excused himself to visit the lavatory near the front of the cabin. As he waited, he found himself near the galley, where he overheard Patricia speaking in low, conspiratorial tones with James about the perceived effort needed to cater to certain passengers. "I don't understand why you're making such an effort with them," Patricia complained, barely aware that Samuel was within earshot. James retorted, "They clearly use points or have some special deal. They're not our typical premium customers." The conversation escalated briefly until Patricia defended herself by denying any racial motivation, insisting that it was all about experience and bearing. Samuel then stepped into view, his presence charged with dignified authority. "Interesting perspective," he said calmly, adding, "Though I am curious what bearing you refer to, especially considering that my family and I have flown over 40 international first-class segments in the past year alone." Patricia's face flushed deeply, and before she could muster another response, James quickly interjected that the lavatory was available, offering Samuel an out from the uncomfortable exchange, but Samuel wasn't ready to let the moment pass without a subtle rebuke. "I'd be interested in continuing this conversation about who looks like they belong in first class," he said softly, "perhaps when you are handing out the pre-landing hot towels." Without waiting for her response, he turned and entered the laboratory, giving both flight attendants time to reflect on the weight of his words. When Samuel returned to his seat, he noticed a striking change in the dynamic of the cabin. Richard Covington had moved to sit temporarily in Vanessa's seat across the aisle, engaging in a careful conversation with her, while Vanessa sat close to Zoe with an expression that mixed surprise with intrigue. Samuel was greeted by Richard with, "I was just introducing myself to your wonderful family. Hope you don't mind my presumption." Samuel, always measured, replied, "Not at all," though his eyes revealed that he was acutely aware of the silent spectacle playing out before the curious eyes of other passengers. Richard continued, "I thought perhaps now would be a good time for that conversation we discussed earlier. James has arranged for us to use the crew rest area for some privacy." Samuel shook Richard's hand, reading the subtle signals of concern, embarrassment, and calculated strategy in the CEO's gaze, before agreeing, "Lead the way." Turning briefly to his family, he said, "I'll be back shortly." Zoe caught his eye and whispered with a knowing lilt, "Strategic, huh?" To which Samuel responded with a small smile and a wink. It was a moment that encapsulated everything that had been simmering throughout the flight. A silent promise of a showdown that would not only expose the cruelty and bias of a deeply flawed system, but also deliver a retributive strike so powerful that the echoes of its impact might one day be felt far beyond the cramped confines of a first-class cabin cruising at 37,000 feet. In that charged atmosphere, with the elegant service of premium dining clashing against the insidious backdrop of racial prejudice, Samuel Hamilton resolved that his long-endured suffering would not be met with silence. Instead, it was time for an audacious response that would challenge every preconceived notion of entitlement and dignity, turning every slight into the catalyst for a monumental confrontation that promised to leave every passenger, indeed every witness of that moment, utterly and perhaps even profoundly awestruck. Samuel Hamilton and Richard Covington found themselves in a cramped little crew rest area tucked behind the cockpit, a space hardly more than a small compartment with a table and 2 jump seats. The atmosphere was tense even before any conversation began. Richard wasted no time breaking the awkward silence. "I want to apologize for what happened during boarding," he started, his voice measured but laced with the weight of corporate decorum. His words, however, barely managed to cover the true depth of what had transpired. Samuel, with a calm yet determined gaze, studied the older man. Richard, with his perfectly coiffed silver hair, bespoke suit, and a Patek Philippe glinting at his wrist. At 67, Richard had been the unchallenged leader of transcontinental airlines for 15 years, guiding the company through turbulent times and industry consolidations. Yet despite his polished exterior, Samuel knew that behind Richard's carefully cultivated image lurked a failure to confront the systemic discrimination that had plagued the airline for decades. "I must ask," Samuel said evenly, "is it unacceptable to witness our kind of treatment on board? Because according to the data I presented last month, these interactions are not rare occurrences. They happen with disturbing regularity on this airline." Samuel's tone was measured but firm, each word resonating with the resolve of a man who had endured too many daily indignities. Richard shifted in his seat, his expression a mixture of discomfort and defensiveness. "Those are isolated incidents," Richard offered, his voice slightly shaky as if trying to dismiss the gravity of the issue. "They are not isolated," Samuel countered gently yet firmly. "They are systemic. The fact that you witnessed an incident yourself within minutes of boarding speaks volumes about how common these injustices really are." For Samuel, this confrontation was not about personal vendetta. It was about exposing a culture that had long marginalized Black travelers. "For me, this is more than just a surprising, uncomfortable incident. For my family, for millions of Black travelers, this is a routine indignity that we brace ourselves for every time we fly." His words hung in the air like a solemn promise that change was overdue. Richard finally sighed, the weight of Samuel's words pressing upon him. "Perhaps you're right, Samuel. I have not experienced this personally, and I have been shielded by layers of corporate protocol. But I have built Transcontinental on a commitment to service, even if I now see that the understanding of that service has glaring blind spots." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "That gap in customer experience costs you millions in lost premium revenue every year," he explained. "Studies show that Black professionals with high discretionary incomes actively avoid airlines where they face discrimination. They tell their friends, colleagues, and even social networks about their experiences. What you see as an isolated incident is in fact a systemic failure." Richard tried to justify his position, saying, "I had viewed it as primarily a public relations issue, something to manage rather than truly transform." Samuel's gaze did not waver. "That is why your diversity initiatives have yet to move the needle, Richard. They create an appearance of inclusion without addressing the underlying culture. When a flight attendant tells a Black family that they do not look like they belong in first class, you are not just offending them, you are undermining the very values your company claims to uphold." Richard's expression hardened as he offered a curt, "Patricia will be disciplined, I can assure you of that." But Samuel was quick to interject. "Disciplining one employee does not fix the culture, Richard. It only teaches your staff to hide their biases better. What I am proposing is something far more radical, a complete overhaul of how Transcontinental approaches service equity. I suggested new training protocols developed by experts in unconscious bias. We need revised performance metrics that ensure consistent treatment across all passenger demographics, and a customer feedback system that specifically tracks the experiences of travelers from different backgrounds." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I have been steadily increasing my stake in Transcontinental. JMV Capital now owns nearly 15% of the outstanding shares, making me your largest non-institutional investor. With that position, as we discussed, I can have a significant influence on how this company evolves." Richard's eyebrows shot up in surprise. 15%? Our last disclosure showed your position at just under 10%. Samuel nodded, his tone proud yet steely. "We crossed the threshold last week, and the SEC filing will be public tomorrow." For a moment, Richard fell silent, his mind clearly recalibrating as he considered the implications of Samuel's newfound power. What began as a courtesy meeting with a significant shareholder now takes on a much greater significance, Richard admitted reluctantly. "When you mentioned wanting to discuss a board position, it appears you are in a position to demand one." Samuel shook his head slowly. "Not demand, I propose. I am not here to create a confrontation. I am here to build a partnership that transforms Transcontinental into the industry leader it should be, both in financial performance and in providing truly exceptional service to all passengers. If I am forced to take a more public stance as an activist investor, I will not hesitate to highlight the glaring disparity between the marketing promises of your airline and the reality experienced by passengers like my family. The business press would find that story compelling, especially with concrete examples like today's incident. Richard's eyes became calculating as he weighed the threat of public exposure against his own reputation and the stability of his control over the company. After a long moment of silence, Richard chuckled, a sound that attempted to mask his inner dread. "You know, when we first met, I dismissed you as just another wealthy investor with a social agenda. I was wrong, Samuel. You are playing a far longer, more sophisticated game." But Samuel's response was immediate and sincere. "This is not a game, Richard. This is about creating lasting change in an industry that has marginalized people who look like me for decades. When you understand that addressing discrimination also makes sound business sense, the path forward becomes undeniable." Richard slowly nodded, the weight of Samuel's words resonating with him. "I believe you are right. The data you presented last month was indeed compelling, and I have been thinking about it more than I care to admit." Then, Samuel leaned in with a proposal designed to be as transformative as it was daring. "Let's use what happened today as a catalyst. Not for punitive action against one employee, which would be a hollow gesture, but for meaningful transformation. Instead of simply firing Patricia, who may be the product of a deeply flawed system, I propose that she be made part of the solution." Richard looked at him with a mix of incredulity and intrigue as Samuel outlined his plan. "I want Patricia to join the team developing new training protocols. Her first-hand perspective, if she is willing to acknowledge and learn from her biases, could be invaluable in identifying and rectifying similar patterns across your service staff. True transformation, Richard, comes not from punishment, but from turning adversaries into allies, from converting routine discrimination into an opportunity for systemic change." Richard's eyes softened as he absorbed this alternative approach. "That is not what I would have expected. Punishment may satisfy the immediate desire for justice, but it rarely creates meaningful change." Samuel nodded. "In business and in life, my father used to tell me that true power lies not in how effectively you can punish those who wrong you, but in how well you can convert adversaries into allies. My father was a humble postal worker, whose wisdom far exceeded that of many executives I have met." Richard murmured. "Your father sounds like a wise man." Samuel replied with a quiet smile. "He was." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the captain's announcement that they were beginning their final approach into JFK International Airport. As they returned to their seats, Samuel could see the ripples of change already in motion. Patricia was moving through the cabin, distributing the pre-landing hot towels. Her usually brisk demeanor now carried the weight of introspection, a shadow of uncertainty in her eyes. Vanessa raised an eyebrow at Samuel as she glanced his way, whispering, "Productive, isn't it?" Samuel replied with a small, proud smile. "Potentially transformative." Across the aisle, Zoe watched Patricia with undisguised curiosity, clearly eager to see what would come next. Meanwhile, Marcus had fallen asleep, his head resting against the window, temporarily shielded from the complex realities that his family contended with daily. As the aircraft began its final descent, Patricia approached Samuel and Marcus with a tray of rolled towels. "Hot towels, sir, young man," she said in a tone that was now subdued and uncertain. Samuel accepted the towel with a neutral nod, but then paused and spoke up. "Patricia, I believe you and I have a conversation to continue." The cabin fell into an expectant hush as all eyes turned toward the exchange. Patricia's professional mask faltered for a moment, revealing the flicker of genuine apprehension beneath. "Sir, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding," she began haltingly, but Samuel interrupted gently yet firmly. "There is no misunderstanding. Earlier, you made assumptions about my family based solely on how we look. I am curious, what do you think a typical first-class passenger looks like?" The question was delivered softly, but it cut deeply through the gentle hum of the cabin. Across the aisle, Vanessa and Zoe watched intently while Richard's eyes remained fixed on the unfolding dialogue. Patricia, caught in the spotlight of her own prejudices, struggled for a response. "It is more about demeanor," she attempted, but Samuel pressed on. Trapped in your own biases, it seems you cannot articulate a clear definition without invoking stereotypes. In that charged moment, the entire cabin felt the gravity of his words. Samuel Hamilton had turned a personal grievance into a profound inquiry into the values of dignity and inclusion. His challenge resonated with every passenger who had ever felt diminished or overlooked, and in doing so, he set the stage for a dramatic confrontation that promised to change not only his own destiny, but the future of an entire industry. Samuel Hamilton looked at Patricia with a steady, thoughtful gaze and said, "I see how you think about how people carry themselves." Her discomfort was plain for everyone watching as she fumbled for words, and in that moment she admitted, "In my 15 years with Transcontinental, yes, I noticed my service pin. I thought it helped me gauge who belongs in premium cabins by their demeanor." The quiet confession hung in the air as Patricia's eyes darted around the cabin. "Sir, I made a mistake in how I approached your family, and I apologize," she added, her tone strained and uncertain. Samuel replied sincerely, "I appreciate that, but an apology without understanding isn't truly meaningful. Let me help you understand something." He gestured broadly to his family seated nearby. "My wife is Dr. Vanessa Johnson, a tenured professor of sociology at Columbia University. My daughter Zoe is headed to Princeton next fall on a full academic scholarship, and my son Marcus is not only a straight-A student, but also nationally ranked in chess." His voice was calm and measured, yet every word carried the weight of years spent fighting daily indignities. Patricia's eyes widened even more as Samuel continued. "I graduated from Morehouse and Harvard Business School before founding JMV Capital Partners 20 years ago. Today, our firm manages over $12 billion in assets, and as of last week, we hold 15% of Transcontinental Airlines, making me the company's largest individual investor." A collective gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Several passengers who had been quietly recording the unfolding drama on their smartphones looked stunned. Even Richard Covington, who had earlier maintained an air of detached authority, now seemed almost amused by the revelation, though his amusement was tinged with unease. Tosha stood frozen, the tray of hot towels forgotten in her trembling hands, as Samuel continued in a voice that was gentle yet commanding. "But here's what's really important. My family deserves dignity and respect, whether we are major shareholders or not. Every passenger does." He swept his gaze toward an elderly black woman seated in the last row of first class, a woman who had listened with shining eyes and quiet resolve throughout the exchange. "Miss Robinson over there deserves the same warm welcome as the CEO sitting behind me, regardless of how she looks or what assumptions you may hold about her circumstances." The woman gave a small nod, her eyes sparkling with emotion, as Samuel's words resonated like a clarion call for justice. He then explained to a now humbled Patricia that the problem was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a culture that had long rewarded biased assumptions without consequence. "Your behavior today is a reflection of a broader issue at Transcontinental, one that has made it acceptable for employees to treat passengers differently just because of how they look. And that is about to change." His tone was both a challenge and a promise, directed not only at her but at everyone witnessing this moment of reckoning. As the plane bumped gently and the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated the cabin, Samuel said, "We should continue this discussion on the ground, and I believe Mr. Covington will want to join us." Patricia nodded wordlessly and resumed her duties with mechanical precision, still visibly shaken by the confrontation. Across the aisle, Zoe couldn't help but let a soft grin escape, whispering audibly enough for others to hear, "Dad, that was way better than just getting mad. You were so strategic." Samuel winked at her and replied with a warm smile, "Strategic indeed." Marcus, with all the admiration and wonder of a child realizing for the first time that his dad wields real power, remarked, "You own part of the airline? That's so cool." Samuel chuckled and ruffled his son's hair before saying, "What's truly cool is having the opportunity to make it better. That is the real privilege of success. Not just sitting in first class, but ensuring everyone in here is treated with the dignity they deserve. As the aircraft descended through the clouds toward JFK, the air in the first-class cabin shifted palpably. The earlier tension had transformed into something more layered, a shared witnessing of a moment when unexamined assumptions were challenged openly. The sense of power in that moment was tangible, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the possibility of change. When passengers disembarked on the jet bridge, the news of the confrontation had spread like wildfire. Whispers, text messages, and discreet recordings circulated. Travelers paused, smartphones in hand, as Samuel's family, flanked by Richard Covington and a visibly shaken Patricia Hewson, moved down the jet bridge. In the terminal, a small crowd of transcontinental executives hastily gathered, alerted by urgent messages from the CEO. Among them was Diane Foster, the airline's chief of customer experience, a woman in her late 50s with a silver bob and an expression of harried determination. Stepping forward, she extended a hand and introduced herself, saying, "I'm Diane Foster. On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, please accept our sincerest apologies for your experience today." Samuel shook her hand but paused, taking in the firm grip and direct gaze that spoke of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Ms. Foster," he said slowly, "I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not interested in mere apologies crafted for public relations purposes. I want real, meaningful change." At that moment, Richard Covington interjected smoothly, "Diane, Mr. Johnson and I have already had a productive discussion about the way forward. I believe we should continue this conversation in the Transcontinental Lounge instead of here in the terminal." Diane looked between them, trying to assess the situation, as she added, "Of course, we have reserved a private meeting room if you and your family would follow me." As they walked through the terminal, Samuel noticed the protective manner in which his family formed around him. Vanessa, steadfast by his side, and the children flanking them with a mixture of pride and apprehension, a posture familiar to many Black families navigating spaces tinged with unspoken tension. Patricia followed at a slight distance, clearly directed by Richard to join the group despite her obvious discomfort, while James Chen had also been invited to accompany them. Samuel suspected that this was Richard's way of acknowledging the contrasting levels of service provided by the two attendants earlier in the flight. The Transcontinental First-Class Lounge was a study in muted luxury. Neutral tones, soft lighting, and discreet staff whose every movement was deliberate. As they were escorted into a private meeting room at the back, Samuel couldn't help but notice the double takes from the staff as they recognized his family. Once settled at the conference table, Richard took control with the practiced ease of a seasoned CEO. "I want to establish something clearly from the outset," he began, addressing everyone present. "What occurred on Flight 1382 today was unacceptable and does not reflect the service standards Transcontinental aspires to maintain." He then turned to Patricia, whose face alternated between flushed and pale, and said, "Ms. Hewson, I believe you have something to say to the Johnson family." Patricia straightened her posture and, with visible effort, began, "Mr. and Dr. Johnson, I want to apologize sincerely for my behavior today. I made unfounded assumptions based on how you looked." At that moment, Zoe, with a confidence that belied her age, supplied, "Based on how you looked." Patricia met Zoe's steady gaze and, after a brief pause, nodded solemnly. "Yes, based on how you looked, I assumed you were not typical first-class passengers, and I treated you differently because of that assumption. It was wrong, and I am truly sorry." Samuel studied her carefully, looking for authenticity beneath the apology, and saw in her eyes the reflection of decades of conditioning. A woman caught in a culture that tacitly rewarded certain biases while pretending to deny them. "Thank you for that acknowledgement," Samuel replied finally. "I appreciate the difficulty of confronting one's own biases publicly. The question now is, what happens next?" Richard exchanged glances with Diane Foster before saying, Typically, in situations like this, we would issue a formal apology, offer compensation in miles or travel vouchers, and take appropriate disciplinary action. Samuel leaned forward, his tone measured but firm. By appropriate disciplinary action, do you mean firing Miss Hewson? He asked, rather than in a confrontational tone, simply stating his observation. Richard nodded slowly and admitted, given the circumstances and the potential public relations impact, that is the standard approach. Samuel's eyes grew intense as he explained. That is exactly the problem with how corporations typically handle these situations. They focus on damage control, removing the most visible symptom while leaving the underlying disease untreated. Instead, I suggest a radically different approach, one that focuses on transformation rather than retribution. He turned to James, who had remained quiet throughout the discussion. James, during your time with Transcontinental, have you received any meaningful training on recognizing and addressing bias in customer interactions? After a moment of hesitation, James replied, we have a 2-hour diversity module during initial training and an annual 30-minute online refresher course, but honestly, it's treated as a checkbox exercise. No one really takes it seriously, he added softly. What happened today isn't unusual. These patterns occur frequently, albeit with subtle differences. Samuel then directed his attention to Diane. Ms. Foster, as the Chief of Customer Experience, what metrics do you track regarding service consistency across different passenger demographics? Do you measure if Black passengers receive the same level of service as white ones, or if travelers from other backgrounds are addressed with equal warmth? The silence that followed was more telling than any answer could be. Turning back to Richard with a steely gaze, Samuel said, this is what true transformation looks like. Not firing one flight attendant and issuing a press release that highlights your commitment to diversity, but fundamentally reimagining how you measure, incentivize, and deliver equitable service. Richard studied Samuel with growing respect as he realized the immense thought that had gone into this confrontation. Samuel's voice softened slightly as he added, I have lived this reality for decades, and I have built my business by identifying opportunities others miss. Transcontinental is missing a massive opportunity to differentiate itself in an industry that has marginalized people like me for far too long. His words resonated deeply as he outlined the path forward, a future where service was not determined by superficial assumptions, but by genuine care and respect for every passenger. In that private meeting room, with the echoes of injustice and hope intertwined, Samuel Hamilton's challenge to transform an entire airline was not just a personal vendetta. It was a clarion call for justice and change that promised to leave everyone present utterly and perhaps even profoundly inspired. Samuel Hamilton, with the steady determination of someone who'd weathered countless storms in boardrooms and on flights, outlined his vision for a complete overhaul of Transcontinental's approach to service equity. He explained that the transformation would start with a thorough audit of the current customer experience. We must deploy sophisticated data analytics and qualitative research to identify exactly how different passenger groups are treated, he said, his tone clear and persuasive. The key is to make the invisible visible. You simply can't improve what you don't measure. Diane Foster, Transcontinental's Chief of Customer Experience, furiously scribbled notes in her leather-bound notebook. Her initial wariness melted into genuine engagement as Samuel proposed integrating anonymous demographic factors into the existing customer satisfaction surveys. That baseline data, he declared, is essential if we're going to know the true extent of inequality, and then fix it. He continued passionately, after that, we implement a comprehensive training program, not a mere checkbox exercise but ongoing coaching with regular reinforcement. Imagine using real examples, perhaps recorded interactions from mystery shoppers, to drive home the message. When people see concrete evidence of biased behavior, they cannot claim ignorance. The room fell silent, except for the soft rustling of pages as everyone absorbed his words. Patricia Hewson, who had been a reluctant participant earlier, finally spoke with a shaky voice. So everyone would see examples of people like me making these mistakes? She asked, uncertainty etched on her face. Samuel turned to her with unexpected gentleness. Not to shame anyone, Ms. Hewson, but to cultivate real awareness. Most biased behavior isn't malicious, it's unconscious, a byproduct of cultural conditioning that we absorb without even noticing. I'm not asking you to shoulder the blame. I'm asking you to help lead the change. Patricia's voice was small as she admitted, I've never really thought of myself as biased. I'd try my best to treat everyone well. Samuel's eyes softened slightly. I believe that too, but you see, intention and impact are entirely different. The path forward isn't about assigning blame, it's about growth, about creating systems that help all of us recognize and correct these patterns. Vanessa Johnson, ever the pillar of support, added her perspective quietly but firmly. In my research on institutional bias, we've learned that personal transformation often begins with that uncomfortable moment of recognition. What you're experiencing now is painful, but it's a productive kind of pain, one that can drive you and all of us toward understanding rather than denial. Patricia nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the seeds of genuine self-reflection that had been planted. Samuel could see that beneath her discomfort lay the possibility of real change, a transformation far more valuable than the defensive reflexes that typically followed punitive measures. Richard Covington, who had been listening with growing interest, turned to Samuel with newfound respect. I've sat through countless discussions on diversity and inclusion over my decades in corporate leadership, he admitted, his voice measured. But this is the first time I've heard it framed in a manner that makes sound business sense while also addressing the human element. Samuel responded with a quiet intensity. Most corporate diversity efforts are designed to check boxes and manage litigation risk. They focus solely on representation numbers rather than the quality of passenger experiences. What I propose addresses both. Richard leaned forward slightly as if to absorb each word. Indeed, diverse representation is meaningless if the environment remains unwelcoming. The real opportunity lies in creating a service culture where every passenger feels genuinely valued. That culture directly translates to customer loyalty and increased premium revenue. As the discussion progressed, specific action items began taking shape. Samuel detailed his plan: a comprehensive service audit, revised training protocols that extended beyond annual refreshers, new metrics for evaluating consistent service quality across all demographics, and even the creation of a leadership pipeline that rewarded inclusive excellence. Patricia, with humility still lingering in her eyes, would participate in developing the training program. Her first-hand experiences of bias would serve as a powerful case study for her colleagues, illustrating exactly how unconscious prejudices manifest and how they can be corrected. Throughout this deep and candid conversation, Samuel was acutely aware of the watchful eyes of his children. Zoe, whose early desire to see harsh punishment for Patricia had softened into an understanding of the complexity of change, observed with a mix of indignation and hope. Marcus, ever perceptive, asked thoughtful questions that hinted he was beginning to grasp the gravity of the issues at stake. After nearly 2 hours of what Samuel described as one of the most productive conversations of his professional life, Richard made a decisive, almost unprecedented gesture. "Samuel," he announced, "I would like to formalize our discussion. I am extending an official invitation for you to join Transcontinental's board of directors, with the specific mandate to chair a new committee on service equity. Your perspective, your expertise, is exactly what our company needs as we move forward." Samuel nodded his acceptance without hesitation. "I would be honored to serve in that capacity. Together, I believe we can transform Transcontinental into a model not just for the airline industry, but for any business that aims to deliver truly exceptional service to every passenger, regardless of appearance or background." As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for follow-up sessions, he felt a surge of pride and relief when Vanessa's hand slipped into his. She leaned in close, whispering with affectionate admiration, "This is why I married you, Samuel. You don't just point out problems, you create solutions that honor everyone's humanity. Samuel squeezed her hand in response, deeply grateful for her steadfast partnership through decades of challenges and triumphs that had led to this transformative moment. Observing this new environment, Vanessa leaned across the aisle and murmured to Samuel, "The ripple effects are real. You can feel the difference in the entire service culture." Samuel nodded in agreement, watching as Eleanor interacted with an elderly South Asian couple just a few rows ahead. "It's not perfect yet, but it's progress," he affirmed. Vanessa then mentioned a recent article in Harvard Business Review featuring a case study on the Transcontinental Service Equity Initiative that was already influencing business school curricula nationwide. Samuel chuckled lightly, remarking that even Richard had mentioned it might soon be published. It's amazing to think that what started as a personal confrontation, a moment of indignity that too many Black travelers have endured, has now become a blueprint for change across the industry, he mused. As the plane pierced through a bank of clouds and emerged into clear blue skies, the symbolism was not lost on Samuel. Sometimes, he thought, breaking through barriers requires momentary turbulence, those brief moments of discomfort that ultimately lead to a view far grander than what was once imagined. With each passing second, he could almost hear his father's voice reminding him that success is not measured by personal comfort, but by the ability to ensure that every person has the opportunity to be seen and respected for who they truly are. Samuel's thoughts drifted to the events that had catalyzed this change, a confrontation that started as a public exposure of bias and ended with a groundbreaking commitment to overhaul Transcontinental's culture of service. His family had endured discriminatory glances and subtle remarks, but that pain had been harnessed into a force for change. It was not just about exacting revenge on those who dared to diminish his family's worth. It was about transforming the very foundations of the service industry so that dignity could become a right rather than a privilege. The revelations about how the airline measured customer service, how the quality of interaction was warped by assumptions based on appearance, and the tangible actions set in motion by his intervention had all converged into a moment of poetic justice. A justice defined not by punishment, but by the promise of a better, more equitable future. At the conclusion of that transformative meeting in the Transcontinental Lounge, where Samuel had laid out a precise blueprint for auditing service metrics and overhauling employee training to root out unconscious bias, the impact was both immediate and far-reaching. The proposal to integrate demographic factors into customer satisfaction surveys and to move beyond mere checkbox exercises had sparked a genuine commitment among the airline's leadership. Even Patricia Hewson, once the very embodiment of the casual yet toxic bias that had precipitated this crisis, had been transformed. Now a key participant in developing new training protocols, she was helping her colleagues understand that bias is often an unintentional product of systemic conditioning, and that recognizing it is the first step toward meaningful change. Later, as the family gathered their belongings and moved through the terminal, whispers of the confrontation swirled around them. Other travelers watched with a mix of awe and admiration as Samuel, Vanessa, Zoe, and Marcus passed by, their dignified demeanor a stark contrast to the old days when a Black family's presence in first class had been questioned. There was a palpable sense among the onlookers that what had transpired was not merely an isolated incident of corporate accountability, but a turning point that could benefit countless passengers who had never seen themselves represented in the glossy pages of an airline's annual report. For Samuel, that was the true measure of success. It was not simply about the numbers on a balance sheet or the prestige that came with controlling a significant share of a major airline. It was about creating spaces where everyone, regardless of appearance, background, or circumstance, felt inherently welcomed. He remembered his father's words, echoing softly in his mind, "It is not enough to get yourself through the door, son. Once you're in the room, you've got to make it better for those coming after you." And in that spirit, Samuel had not only challenged a system steeped in discrimination, but had also set forth a roadmap for a future where every passenger could experience genuine hospitality and respect. As the aircraft descended and the city below began to emerge in a tapestry of glittering lights and sprawling avenues, Samuel's heart swelled with a sense of purpose. He watched as Marcus, now comfortable in an environment that had once made him feel like an outsider, turned the pages of his book with renewed curiosity. Zoe, engaged in thoughtful conversation with Vanessa, exhibited a confidence that promised to challenge outdated assumptions in her own future endeavors. And Vanessa, the steady, eloquent force behind Samuel's unwavering commitment, smiled softly, her eyes reflecting pride and hope in equal measure. In that final stretch before landing, as the plane's engines hummed steadily and the soft glow of the terminal beckoned in the distance, Samuel recognized that true transformation is not an end but a beginning. The changes enacted aboard Transcontinental were already being felt. A shift in service culture that extended beyond routine gestures of politeness to a genuine embrace of each traveler's humanity. The new training programs, the revised performance metrics, and the proactive steps taken by the airline's leadership promised to redefine the industry standard, setting an example for companies far and wide. As the aircraft's wheels touched down and the cabin lights brightened, Samuel felt a profound sense of peace. He knew that the struggle against discrimination had been long and arduous, and that there were still challenges ahead. However, on that day, his personal legacy, and the legacy of every person who had ever been made to feel unwelcome, had been rewritten. The journey had proven that true power lies not in wielding authority for its own sake, but in using influence to create lasting, positive change for everyone. And so, with the first-class cabin now an emblem of transformation rather than exclusion, Samuel Hamilton left the plane with his family by his side, carrying with him not just the satisfaction of a hard-fought victory, but the promise that every future traveler would step into a world where they truly belonged. This was the legacy he intended to leave behind. A legacy where the measure of success was not the ability to secure comfort for oneself, but the opportunity to expand the circle of dignity, so that it embraced all who dared to dream of a more just and compassionate world.